Thursday. But today we're going to begin with a talk from Lorraine Boran from the School of Psychology on the ethical issues around neuroscience. Lorraine is not only an authority on neuropsychology, but is also, making us all look bad, developed an expertise in the legal and ethical aspects of cutting-edge developments in neuroscience. I've been lucky enough to work with Lorraine before, so I know this talk is going to be extremely interesting. As new technologies are developed, the brain itself is becoming a site of conflict regarding privacy, with huge philosophical and legal implications. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lorraine Boran, who will discuss this final frontier. If you have any questions and answers, put them into the chat and we'll discuss them after. So over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you so much, Fiachra, for that wonderful introduction. I'm not sure I'll live up to it, but I'm happy to share my ideas and a little bit of the work that we're doing. And you rightly mentioned that maybe it's 6+ years ago we had our first coffee looking at these ethical issues, and I think we submitted to the Neuroethics conference, an annual conference in that space. And since then, I think we've been talking about some of the issues that will come up today. I'm just going to share my screen now. So if you can let me know that you've good visibility. Is that good? Can everyone see it?
Yep.
Yeah. So today I want to talk about ethical issues of neuroscience. My background is neuropsychology. So I started off looking at rehabilitation, and many of the models, the approaches, the tech approaches in particular that we'll look at today emerge within a framework of rehabilitation. So the goal is to provide a restitution of function. So where there's loss of function due to progressive or acquired brain injury, for example. But of course, these approaches and these technologies, including brain imaging technologies, have other lives. So they can be applied to enhancement. So we'll look a little bit about that as well, the evolution of these neurotechnologies. So I want to talk about privacy as well. So I'll use an ethics framework to talk through some of the issues of neuroscience, but also bring in really important aspects of privacy. I had to start with Elon Musk. I must do so. If we're talking about privacy's final frontier, I think looking at some of the neurotechnologies, the cognitive technologies that are entering our market now is really important as part of this discussion. Neuroethics as a field, though, is not very young. So within the last decade, much of the discussion has been on the types of brain imaging technologies that we can use to read our minds, so to speak, and how it can be applied within our justice system, our criminal justice system, so the criminal courtroom. And it speaks to this unexplored continent lying behind what is the populated shores of ethics and then neuroscience. So what we know about growing precision, and algorithm competencies in brain imaging. So that could be functional brain imaging, but also techniques such as transcranial brain stimulation that can temporarily knock out healthy areas of the brain in order to lift the hood on what areas of the brain are important for certain functions, but also to see, what is the immediate or the after effect of just temporarily knocking out a region of the brain. So we use these types of techniques in looking at structural damage, typically within the brain. So, the context here is very much about patients and about rehabilitation. We also look at functional aspects. So what does a typically developing brain look like? What does a typical healthy adult brain look like when speaking, when recalling memories, for example, when making a decision? And what we know about these brain imaging techniques is that there are ways of reading the brain, and with that information, we can potentially use that to change the function of the brain. So we can up or down regulate areas of the brain, and it can have thinking impacts, so cognitive impacts, but also behavior impacts. So it can change a person's potentially their identity, values, and personality, as well as how they respond in any given situation. So it emerged as a subfield because many of the researchers, so neuroscience as well as legal and ethics researchers, were interested in that interface between how the law in particular admits, brain evidence and what these technologies can do. So at the beginning of this decade, and even from early 1980s, we knew that there are brain signals, so what are called readiness potentials, that can tell us well in advance of when you are aware you're about to make a decision, what you can do. So we can predict in advance based on brain signals what you are about to do. You're unaware of that. So in the timeline, so these are the Libet types of studies, we know that this data, this information can predict with confidence, not just simple motor planning, so you're about to pick up a coffee cup, for example, but also decisional type aspects, so discriminating between colors and also higher level decision making. So we've known for quite a bit that brain data is important, and it can predict what you're unaware of, what you're about to do. Also with these types of brain technologies, we can potentially look at regions of the brain that light up or are activated when you see something familiar. And of course, in the absence of verbally indicating or communicating your thoughts, your brain data can betray your thinking, so to speak. So we've already been grappling with these issues of brain imaging and technologies, and how we can, in a sense, hack the technology. So if we can read important information from the brain, can we use that almost like a feedback system to alter brain function and or communicate on behalf of the patient? So these brain imaging and neurotechnologies have led to inevitable brain engineering to interface with other technologies. So Elon Musk's breakthrough technology, and you can read a lot more about it, is about interfacing the brain with mobile technology and other technologies so that the person can control how they make decisions by brain activity. This has not entered not only the clinicals, the rehabilitation world, or the commercial world without an ethics discussion. So I've taken screen grabs from so many papers that allude to the ethical issues. So, an integrated brain machine interface platform with thousands of channels that can basically allow an individual, so this firewall between the individual's brain and interfacing technologies to decide how the brain can respond to environmental feedback, to make decisions on behalf of the person so that the technologies can communicate on behalf of the person. And you can see from a clinical perspective, from a rehabilitation perspective, if we're talking about someone who cannot communicate or someone who, because of paralysis, cannot move, these types of interfaces can help perform functions that without this brain interface, the person wouldn't be able to engage in their social or their physical environment. However, the Neuralink, which it has become known, is an ethics maze. Elon Musk is quoted as saying, it's kind of like a Fitbit in your skull with tiny wires. And I suppose our discussion today can center, of course, on this notion of the Fitbit in the skull, but more broadly on these types of neurotechnologies that interface with other technologies and can act and represent the person or the patient. But of course, there are commercial applications And it may not always be about restitution of function. Of course, it can be about brain enhancement as well. So this audacious vision of a smartphone-controlled brain-machine interface can come with potential risks. So we'll talk through, and I've outlined to some resources if you're interested to see what the discussion has been within the past year or so. When you look at much of the literature looking or discussing the ethical or data protection, or even some of the legal implications from constitutional digital rights, for example, where the conversation begins with rehabilitation, there's almost an immediate acceptance of the benefit of the technology. Of course, managing the risks. But when it moves into that conversation about brain enhancement and what that can mean, so this notion of super intelligence or super control, so emotion, mood regulation, so upgrading your thinking, so to speak, then it triggers many of the ethics debates, including what these technologies have access to. So the ethics of advanced brain-machine interfaces are really, really important to unpack. And some of the work that we do, so where we use brain imaging to track typical neurodevelopment, to be able to differentiate between dysfunctional versus typical development, these types of brain data are important. They're predictive. And of course, they can identify targets for treatment. And within a rehabilitation framework, a lot of these benefits outweigh putative risks. However, when it comes, as I said, to enhancement, so where you have a typical brain and you're enhancing intelligence or other types of control processes within the brain, so the brain CEO, so to speak, then it can be a sticky issue. If we cast our minds back to what Musk is now doing, it has a history in deep brain stimulation. So this is reading the brain to produce movement, for example. So in Parkinson's disease or other disorders where there is aberrant or dysfunctional movement, it makes sense that these types of technologies can read the brain and then produce movement on behalf of the person. However, for psychological phenomena, so decision-making, emotion control, it is much more inexact. Machine learning, of course, as a processing interface between the person's brain and the neurotechnologies, that act on their behalf, brings into it, especially for psychological phenomena, an element of the unknown. So if you look at some of the work that has been done, and some of the work that I'll go through some case studies, and it's some of the work that we hopefully will be working on, future studies as well as work that we are working on, can center on this notion of decision making. So what are the decision making algorithms behind the machine learning or that processing interface between the patient and technology? And what issues does it speak to when we think about this notion of self-governance? If we take something as simple as closed loop decision-making, so where managing one's mood can be regulated in this way, it could lead to situations where having low mood or negative affect, as we call it, might be appropriate, might be socially appropriate. So at grieving, for example, but in a closed loop situation, it might create the situation of it's not good to be sad. So where certain moods are not permitted. But it brings up the broader question of, for some of these psychological phenomena and using closed loop, decisional algorithms, what impacts can it have psychologically on the individual and more broadly, of course, on society? The other, if we think about this type of interfacing technology, it brings into question this notion of hybrid agency as well, of course. So, and this is where, and some of the work that I do in law and neuroscience is about criminal responsibility, about accountability. And this was the really big concern with some of these technologies and also neuroscience evidence. Would it begin speaking to one's legal responsibility? And if we look at these types of interfaces, it probably is suggesting some sort of hybrid agency. So if we look at the predictive aspects of the technology acting on behalf of the person and some of the unintended consequences, of course, many of these technologies are designed to produce certain effects, movement, or alter mood, or to trigger the individual to take medication to stop or halt an epileptic fit, or these types of things. But there can be unintended consequences. We know it with other non-invasive enhancement technologies, brain fitness or brain training tools, that you can have direct but also indirect effects of stimulating certain regions of the brain. And the brain, as a result, its plasticity, its experience-dependent learning represents these experiences. And we don't always know what those unintended consequences are. So what does that mean? You know, who has ultimate agency when we're talking about choice? And if we step forward maybe to more advanced approaches to the brain interface, a really nice Guardian article there, a short read on this notion of privacy. So in reading the brain, and there are companies already out there, No Lie, fMRI, and so on, that claim to be able to read brain signals so that they can detect when you're telling truth versus concealing. So, you know, they can get at your thoughts. There are companies, and I'll talk about BrainCom in a moment, that can translate brain activity so that the technology can speak on behalf of or communicate on behalf of the patient. Of course, you know, are there situations or scenarios that we can foresee where private thoughts may be communicated on behalf of the patient? And, you know, the situation is that we don't know yet. There may be unintended consequences. And of course, it can get at this notion of privacy. Within the law and neuroscience field, very often what is a real fear is the notion that the brain may be subpoenaed. So you might invoke your right to silence. You don't verbally indicate or answer. And that is a right, of course. But that's based on brain activity, in a sense. It betrays that you were at the scene, or you do recognize this person, or your brain, the reward system is responding to this type of picture or addiction cue. So you may be an addict. So these types of issues make us question the notion of what brain data are private. And of course, if you open up that question, there's the notion of Neurorights. So are these legitimate legal rights? And it's really interesting studying something like BrainCom and what they purport to do. You know, and most of these commercial entities have people who head up their ethics. So design by ethics, privacy by design, trust in technology and AI, and so on. And some have been quoted as saying maybe there are digital rights to expression, and this is supporting it, this neurotech is supporting it. But it also brings into question how it's impacting on this notion of the self, so identity, and also these kind of thorny issues related to integrity. So we know we have these constitutional protections for our bodily integrity, but it can be less clear across different jurisdictions when it comes to mental or cognitive integrity, and what these neurotechnologies are doing in terms of, you know, is it unsafe, unprotected search and source of our thoughts, and how it potentially is violating privacy. And of course, there is a very, very real focus, and that includes with research and research that we do, where you work with the public, you work with patients, so we call it PPI, in developing neurotechnologies so that trust is centered, transparency is centered, and that, of course, brain data and privacy is important. So it is pushing us, of course, towards this new human rights in the age of neuroscience. And a really nice paper here on this notion that we should protect. And there has been a movement, a really nice EU, and I'll link out to a paper on this, a strategic plan for being able to support that. And Spain and Chile, I think, have made movements as well to seriously look at, and in the example of Chile, I think, to embody digital rights as a constitutional right. And what's really important in this is looking at this kind of interface. How do we also protect the person against intrusion or against alteration of their brain? And it could have these impacts on identity and so on. And these are the words of David Grant cited in this paper here. In terms of future work and some of the issues that I have and we have looked at, is that there's a decade-long more work done on different types of brain technologies, including EEG, so simply just measuring electrical activity from the skull of the participant to detect false or concealed memory. And of course, this could have implications in terms of eyewitness testimony, and that's, I in part was very interested in how this could be viewed within a criminal law perspective and across different jurisdictions. So these technologies are becoming more sensitive, they're more predictive, and of course where brain data are shared, and that's probably even a separate conversation, to the to this public and open big data sharing of brain data, where these technologies are becoming more sophisticated. But the issues it raises are around public acceptability of using this type of technology in this way. So in the absence of you verbally indicating or making a statement that your brain, in a sense, can, and that is trusted, it's the more objective. Excuse me. Of course, as part of any of these technologies, there's the issue of counter. A person countering or understanding how the technology works so that they can beat the technology. And we don't know enough to be able to say that we legitimately are representing the individual's thoughts or intentions. In most of these studies, we have very compliant, so individuals who consent who are compliant, but if it's applied to other types of cohorts, including those within prison, where a lot is at stake, we don't know if countermeasures can be used to beat the technology. So admission as evidence is a thorny issue because based on peer review, reliability and validity, these types of technologies may have inbuilt errors and biases, and of course these bring up a lot of ethical considerations. Some other work that, so this isn't our work here, I'm just outlinking to interesting papers, but developing a technology toolkit to support decision capacity within our jurisdiction, we assume capacity. That's the Assisted Decision Making Act. And part of this is looking at whether we can look at early predictors of decisional capacity or loss of capacity, and how we can support capacity. And some of the neurotech, so it's not only brain or imaging, but it can be coupled. So looking at someone's handwriting, for example, coupled with functional as well as structural imaging, can be very powerful in predicting where and when in the brain function may be compromised, for example. So using AI to model thinking and other factors in handwriting to predict cognitive function. I mean, this is very powerful from a predictive point of view, that if in midlife this could predict a decade in advance who will experience, mild cognitive impairment or or potentially more serious conditions such as any of the dementias. So this brain data is important, and the AI that's developed to model it is important. And of course, one of the issues here is on the diverse brain. Is diversity built in to debias these types of algorithms? So we're looking at something broadly similar in terms of a grant proposal, but we know from the get-go that public acceptability will be a consideration, and ethical considerations where you might predict a risk status for someone where the trajectory of that disease or the burden of that disease may be non-modifiable, or there may be no treatment option. So how do you manage these big ethical issues, as well as, of course, privacy issues? Who has access to these data? Who own these data? And how can they be used in terms of by other parties? So we know that this already exists. We know lots of people are doing this type of work using AI to assess Alzheimer's risk, for example, by looking at how the brain produces speech, so fluency and aspects of language in that way, as well as writing. So, it can be flipped and used as a screener for risk status or as a predictor for the developmental trajectory of a disease. So I guess in looking at these possible cases and some of these examples, they're probably, I tried to fit in all F's, so this is not a framework by any means, but there's some factors for sure to consider. In developing these neurotechnologies, generally the genesis is, it's rehabilitative, but then it moves generally into enhancing type of technology. So it starts off as assistance or dependence based, and of course, the ethical concern with some of these neurotechnologies, including the Neuralink, is that if there is some type of dependence built in, does a patient or does a client have to continue almost like a subscription service to be able to interface with the world? So what function and how does a facilitator support the person? And of course, there's the fit with the person. So are these technologies designed to become a part of the person's life, so habitual? And we've seen some case studies of these types of, especially persuasion type technologies that nudge you to make certain decisions, that qualitatively people who are interviewed will say it feels like it's part of them, it feels like it's part of their identity. And this is important ethically to consider what that means. There is the emotive, the fear, the fun. So what are the psychological motivators behind these types of technology? And it kind of links in with, maybe we call it the fringe aspect, but there are ethical concerns around developing neurotechnologies that tap into our reward systems. And I know later in the week that this obviously separately will be looked at, but from the work that we do, we know that we call it the HOT system, the reward-based system, that tapping into that can be strongly motivating, but it can have unintended consequences. And we know it, these aberrations in the reward system can underlie development of many psychological conditions, including addiction and so on. So potentially I'm asking, is it a nudge too far? But I think it needs to be considered. And of course, there's feedback. So responsivity to the user's needs and this notion of co-design. So as I mentioned, this PPI, so at the get-go, when we're designing these neurotechnologies, that we work with patients, with caregivers, we work with the public to be able to build these better technologies. But the big ethical issues, I mean, there are many. These types of cognitive technologies call into question the notion of, cognitive liberty and our sense of autonomy, and potentially erode very, very important aspects of privacy, so our private thoughts. And of course, it can lead to all environmental and behavioral manipulations can lead an individual open to coercion and so on, but we don't know what this firewall is like between the person's brain and these interfacing technologies. So, and what are the unintended outcomes? What types of changes, direct and indirect, immediate and longer term, follow these types of manipulations? And there are vulnerability concerns as well. Very often these technologies are developed for incredibly vulnerable cohorts, but if due to commercialization and the inevitable translation to the broader public, they become more enhancement technologies. Does it render an individual vulnerable if they don't participate with these enhancement technologies? And it calls into question the notion of bias. So what is culturally deemed to be enhancing or to be the performance level we need to attain to be able to engage in enriching life. The notion of diverse brains. So it's a very separate area looking at neurodiversity, and it's one of the, I actually don't have it here, but the areas that I'm researching where you can adopt a very social model of psychological conditions, and this notion of disorder or disability is not accepted, and it is this notion of inevitable brain diversity and how that should be supported. So are these technologies representing diverse brains? And of course, this notion of privilege. So access to these technologies may privilege some over others, and inevitably that will create social distancing in some respects, and it calls into question these types of ethics questions that we need to consider. I know separately this week we'll look at nudge theory, persuasion, and change, but it is interesting. This is looking at some of the case studies and the qualitative interviews with patients. But here, I guess I was surprised by not telling an adult they had to go to bed before 10:30. So looking at some of the experiences of individuals and behavioral nudges, and what if a technology in some senses is kind of building in these types of expectations and biases and nudging our behavior toward a certain standard. And I want to close off with, and apologies if I'm closing off a little bit earlier, but this notion of continuing the conversation. In terms of neuroethics in DCU and the broader Irish perspective, I think there is a very strong framework here. So the Council of Europe and this governance of technology and what it can mean for developing these types of brain imaging and brain interfaces, and moving forward how we can frame these ethical and privacy issues in a human rights perspective. And some of the work I do with neurodiversity, looking at autism spectrum disorder in particular, is looking at framing rights in this way. And in particular, this notion of cognitive or mental privacy, and how it is related to the sense of self and identity, and how we can move forward and advocate for protections there. And I think we have very strong community within DCU who work in this area, and I would be more than happy to continue that conversation today and into the future.